Hello, everybody. I'm Everton de Oliveira from the Groundwater Project, and I'm pleased to bring you here today John Drage. He's presenting us his new book, the book about domestic wells. It's a very nice book. John is a senior hydrogeologist with Nova Scotia Geological Survey in Nova Scotia, Canada, with long experience on groundwater quality and management. Welcome, John. Please introduce yourselves to your future readers. How did you become a hydrogeologist? And why have you decided to cover this important topic on a book for the Groundwater Project, please?
Well, thank you very much, Everton, for that introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As you mentioned, my name is John Drage, and I'm a hydrogeologist with the Nova Scotia Geological Survey in Nova Scotia, Canada. And I became a hydrogeologist partly because of my interests and also partly by chance. So I did my undergraduate degree in geology, but I was also interested in engineering and math, and I was taking courses in those subjects. And then I took an introductory course in hydrogeology and quite enjoyed it, and found that it was a very quantitative science that combined my interests in both earth science and math. And then the chance part happened to me after I graduated my geology degree. There was a recession in the early 90s, and it was very difficult to get work in geology because of the slowdown in mineral exploration work. But at the same time, there were employment opportunities in hydrogeology because there was a lot of work going on in contaminant hydrogeology to clean up groundwater at industrial sites. So I decided to go back to school and do my master's in hydrogeology. And then I found work as soon as I graduated in New Zealand, and then spent my career initially as a consultant and then with government for the last 20 years. And so with respect to domestic wells, I first began working on domestic wells when I started working for the government of Nova Scotia, because our province relies heavily on domestic wells. We have more than 40% of our population that uses domestic wells as their water supply. And we've had our share of both groundwater quality problems in domestic wells, such as naturally occurring arsenic and uranium, as well as seasonal droughts, which have occurred recently that have caused many domestic wells to go dry. So domestic wells are a very important issue in my home province in Nova Scotia. And when John Cherry asked myself and Stu Hamilton, who's at the Ontario Geological Survey, to work on a series of books on domestic wells for the Groundwater Project, I saw this as a great opportunity to help promote awareness about a very important topic in hydrogeology.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you for grabbing that. That was very, very important, and a nice book you prepared. You presented interesting stats about domestic wells in your book. From them, how many people use domestic wells in the world? Can you have a guess? Because there are many.
Yeah, so just to start off, to clarify for our listeners, domestic wells are wells that are privately owned and used to provide water to individual households, or sometimes to a few households at a time. And they're the most common types of water supplies in rural areas where public water supplies are not available, although they're also used in urban areas to a lesser extent. So in terms of how many people use domestic wells worldwide, we don't really know precisely because data is not available for all countries. However, it's likely that hundreds of millions of people worldwide rely on domestic wells. And I've seen some estimates that put that number at about 1 billion people worldwide. Now, if we look at specific countries where we do have data on domestic well use, such as Canada, where about 4 million people use domestic wells, and the United States, where it's estimated that 42 million people use domestic wells, those numbers represent about 11% and 13% of the total population of those countries, although it does vary greatly from country to country. So in more densely populated countries in Europe, such as England and Germany, it's estimated that only about 1% of their populations use domestic wells.
Yeah, but developing countries, this number must be higher, I believe, right?
in developing countries, it can be very high because of a lack of public water systems. But those countries, developing low-income countries, can be difficult to get accurate estimates of how many domestic wells are being used. But more information is becoming available because of United Nations goals to ensure that people worldwide have access to clean, safe drinking water. So more and more researchers are trying to make estimates of how many people are using domestic wells in low and middle income countries now. And that research has just been starting to come out in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, I hope you are correct. Because here in Brazil, for example, it's impossible to know. We try to know, some of the wells, because domestic wells here, you don't have to register or get a permit or anything, right? So it's practically impossible to know all the wells that exist.
Well, I'm glad to hear that from you because I did look and try to find how many domestic wells were in Brazil, and I couldn't find any information. So I'm glad that
it's not your fault.
Telling me that I was correct. Yeah,
it's not your fault. Definitely not. I've been involved in trying to gather some numbers, but even for professionally drilled wells, like deeper wells, 100 meters wells, something like that, we don't have. Our estimate here in Brazil is that about 90% of the wells are not registered or don't have a permit or anything, right? That's
so often I find most countries are estimating the amount of number of domestic wells through census data. But often you really have to drill down into the data to get that information. And when I was putting together an estimate of how many people use domestic wells worldwide, I contacted researchers in several countries, and some of them I was surprised that they had similar stories like you're mentioning for Brazil. For example, China, the researchers there tell me, nope, that information is not available. So really the estimate of hundreds of millions of people worldwide, perhaps 1 billion, is really just a rough estimate as that at this point. But it's clear the numbers are high, so it's an extremely important topic because of the number of people that rely on them for their water supplies.
I totally agree with you. You know how we estimated our numbers here, because we checked the number of pumps that are sold.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Because if you a well pump is used in a well, definitely, right? So we know the number of pumps that are sold.
Yes.
And we estimated from there. So okay, a few of them are used for replacement. So we have a number by a rough estimate of how many pumps you have to replace, how many years it takes to replace a pump, and then we arrived at the number.
Well, that's very interesting. I haven't heard that method yet, but there are lots of other methods I've seen various jurisdictions use. So one of them would be to use well record databases. But they tend not to be that accurate either because they're usually not complete and they don't track wells which have been abandoned. I've seen other people, other jurisdictions use the information that they have on public water supplies, which are often in many jurisdictions, they're regulated. And so we know the population that they serve, and then you can subtract the total population from the population that's served by public water supplies, and that gives you a rough estimate of how many people use domestic wells, although it doesn't account for people that might be using rainwater cisterns and surface water supplies. And I've even seen the USGS just use the population density as a method for predicting when you get to a certain density, people tend to have public water systems available. So I've seen them also predict how many people are using domestic wells strictly based on population density around the country. So there are lots of different methods to do it, but they're all estimates, really.
Yeah, exactly. They're all estimates. It's hard to know exactly and know the problem with that. We can get a rough estimate, but then we don't reach the well owner, so we don't know, we can get an information to him on quality issues and things like that. Then we're gonna talk about that in our interview. Just a moment. So
Sure.
before we jump into that, tell us how your book is structured and what is the public that you have in mind when you prepare this book.
Yeah, so the book is primarily aimed at students and groundwater professionals who have a background in water science and want to learn more about domestic wells. Although it could also be of interest to domestic well owners. They may also find it useful, but it's primarily aimed at students and groundwater professionals. And the way my book is structured is that it's an introduction and overview of domestic wells, because we hope eventually to have a series of books that provide greater detail on specific domestic well topics. So, and that's why I say my book is more of an overview and an introduction. So the topics that I cover are such things as how are domestic wells constructed, who uses them, how much water a domestic well needs to provide for household use, the water quality of domestic wells, which was a big and important topic. I discussed the vulnerabilities of domestic wells from a quality and quantity point of view, and also the several ways that are used to protect domestic wells.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks. So domestic wells are the most ubiquitously distributed private source of water for millions. You mentioned hundreds of millions or even billions of people use that, right? And still, most of them are unregulated and, of course, badly monitored. This is the problem with these wells. Tell us about your experience in different countries. I know you're not in Canada now, you're in a different country as well, right? And I have a question for you that is more of a philosophical thing. Is the lack of regulation a bad thing overall? Like, if you put too much regulation, would that, like you restrict the use of wells? That's the idea, please.
Yeah, so I'll start off on the first part of that question about the need for more water quality monitoring is certainly one of the key vulnerabilities for domestic wells. Right. And water quality testing of domestic wells is really important to do because many of the contaminants that are regularly found in domestic wells that can affect human health have no odor or taste or visual indicators. So the only way we know if the water is safe to drink is if we have it tested at a lab. But unfortunately, testing rates for domestic wells are very low, and surveys commonly indicate that less than half of domestic well owners have tested their well in the last 10 years. And really that situation is similar for most countries, that there is not enough testing being done. And then when researchers go and actually do water quality surveys, what they find is, by testing domestic wells, they find that commonly about 40% of domestic wells exceed at least one health-based water quality guideline. Wow. So this is a really important finding that, nice. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide are using domestic wells as their water supply. As many as 40% exceed health-based water quality guidelines, yet hardly anybody is doing the testing to find out whether or not it's safe to drink. So there clearly is a need to improve testing rates of domestic wells. And to answer your question about regulation, I think this is a really complex problem that likely needs to be addressed with a combination of solutions to improve things significantly. And so that can include regulation, but also we need more outreach and awareness programs so that we can reach domestic well owners and tell them about the importance of testing their wells. And also we need ways of making the testing easier and a lot less costly for well owners. And so we need to do a combination of all of these things to make significant improvements in the testing rates of domestic wells. Yes,
true. Well, when you were mentioning that, I was thinking, here in Brazil we have an experience. Actually, it's a culture due to an experience. In the beginning of the 1900s here in Brazil, 1 out of 4 children died of waterborne disease, right? And so the reason was mostly because they used a domestic well. It was closed, lack of sanitation. So you had the sewage close to the well, and that's the problem. So the sanitary agents here in Brazil, they decided to close the wells. So the well closure was a typical solution for that. So that holds still today in many places, even in places that people are educated enough to access the water quality of the well. Sometimes the agents go there and they close the well, right? That's interesting. So well, this shallow dug well, as we call the domestic well, are usually easy and cheap to be drilled. So they're very accessible for poor and uneducated people. So I mentioned some, like the sanitation, but what are the big typical threats found in these wells and how they affect the communities that use their water? I mentioned one, but you have lots of experience. You've seen other things.
Yeah, so shallow dug wells, they can be a practical and reliable source of water. However, they can also be vulnerable to both water quality and quantity problems. And I've experienced this myself because shallow dug wells are used not only in low and middle income countries, but also developed countries. And my household well in Nova Scotia is a shallow dug well. So I've experienced some of these problems firsthand. So with respect to water quality and shallow dug wells, they tend to be more vulnerable to contamination from shallow groundwater. That often will contain microbial contaminants such as bacteria and viruses, nitrates, and other contaminants that originate at the ground surface. So that's one aspect of shallow well vulnerability. Another is water quantity. So because their dug wells are shallow, they don't extend very far below the water table. So they can be very vulnerable to drought and drops in the water table elevation, which can cause them to go dry. And this exact situation has happened to me with my own personal well in Nova Scotia, which went dry during a drought we had in Nova Scotia. So the shallow dug wells are much more vulnerable than deeper drilled wells to droughts and drops in groundwater levels. So how this affects communities is that communities that rely heavily on dug wells can have significant water supply problems, especially during droughts. And as I mentioned before, we saw this in Nova Scotia when we had a pretty significant drought in 2016 that caused over 1,000 water wells to go dry. And more than 90% of the wells that went dry during that drought were shallow dug wells. So this has a huge impact on the communities that rely on this, on shallow dug wells. And in our case, local governments had to respond by providing community fill stations and bottled water to help people until their water well levels recovered.
Oh, yeah. Well, a shallow dug well, people mention when I talk to well owners, domestic well owners, is that since it's a large diameter well, it holds a lot of water. So it's a water container as well, right? That's what they mention, right? So
they do that. That is one of the advantages. So if it's a low permeability aquifer, yeah, you don't have to rely strictly on water flowing in from the aquifer for your peak needs, because you have a water well in storage as long as you have a significant amount of water water height in the well, that is.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mentioned. So what are the responsibilities of the well drillers in Nova Scotia? And in your opinion, what should they be for all well drillers, regardless of the country? This is a tricky question, I know, because, but I want to, from your experience, what would be the minimum thing to have from well drillers?
Yes, so I can mention what we have in Nova Scotia. So in Nova Scotia, the well drillers are responsible for constructing wells in accordance with our well construction regulations, which are very similar to the well construction regulations that many other jurisdictions have. So well construction regulations typically include requirements for driller licensing. So that specifies who can construct a water well. They also specify the types of materials that have to be used for the well construction. They specify well design requirements, setback distances from sources of contamination, like septic systems. They also specify the type of well yield testing that needs to be done once the well is constructed. And also they specify reporting requirements. So completing and submitting well water records that are then added to the government database so we can keep track of where wells are. So that's what we include in Nova Scotia, but there are some things that we don't include that I've seen in other jurisdictions that I think are a good idea. And some of those include well tagging, which is a tag that's a permanent tag that's placed on the casing of a well above the ground so we can track the location and data from the well. I think that's a good idea. We don't have that in Nova Scotia, but a lot of other jurisdictions do. And I've also seen other jurisdictions that require water quality testing to be done at the time that the well is installed. And I think that's a really great idea. This goes back to our earlier discussion about the lack of water quality testing. So there are some places that require domestic wells to have their water quality tested at the time that the well is constructed. And then also some other jurisdictions that require the water quality to be tested during a real estate transaction. We don't have that requirements in Nova Scotia, and they're not that common worldwide, but I think they're a good idea because we certainly need to improve water quality testing of domestic wells in any ways that we can.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's an interesting idea. Yeah. So what are the responsibilities of the state then with respect to the water use in Nova Scotia, and what's your suggestions for other countries?
So in general, with groundwater resources, governments are typically responsible for the management and protection of groundwater resources. And that includes protecting it from contamination and ensuring that its use remains sustainable, both for humans and for the environment, because we mustn't forget that humans aren't the only ones who depend on groundwater. Groundwater base flows need to be maintained to sustain aquatic habitats. So ensuring sustainability requires a number of things that usually governments are responsible for. So typically that would include a groundwater permitting system for allocating groundwater use. Also preparing groundwater budgets, so we know how much groundwater is available in each aquifer and how much has already been allocated. And then, of course, we need monitoring of the quality and quantity of groundwater using groundwater monitoring networks to ensure that our predictions about sustainability and water quality can be demonstrated through actual monitoring of the networks.
That's true. Well, actually, we have a book from Gavin, right? Is a colleague of yours, I believe, right? About monitoring and well data information, right?
Yeah, that's right. Gavin is certainly a data expert that I work with, and has a lot of expertise in especially well record databases, but also other types of groundwater chemistry databases and pumping test databases. And all of this information is very valuable to governments in their efforts to manage groundwater resources, because we need to track both the quality and quantity of available groundwater.
Good. Well, I have, when we were working here with some wells, some people gave some ideas, and I would like to use your brain power here to help me with that, if you could. Well, some people came with the idea of like having, Internet of Things. So like I thought about that when you mentioned the tagging the well. but instead taking the pump or something like that, that we can get some information from the well that is readily available, because you have an electric wire there, and you could get some more from the well. And this electronic devices are very cheap today. Have you have any experience with that? What do you think?
Yeah, actually, thank you for that question. That's sort of a topic that I am very interested right now. Using Internet of Things technology and low-cost sensors for monitoring domestic wells. And I think hydrogeologists, we as a profession, we can do a better job taking advantage of new technologies to monitor our groundwater, both the quality and quantity. And with the way technology has improved, we can also do this in real time and do it remotely at a fairly reasonable cost. And so what we've been doing in Nova Scotia is using this low-cost technology with ultrasonic sensors connected to low-cost Internet of Things chips to build real-time sensors that are put in domestic wells around the province. And we can, and these are for monitoring real-time groundwater levels, but also we've modified them to monitor groundwater quality also. So right now I'm testing temperature and electrical conductivity probes, both also very low cost probes. So I can build these devices for less than about $200 each. And then I can run them for a year for about $5. And they stream data remotely to the internet, and the information is available in real time. So the sensors that we're using are ultrasonic sensors that send a ultrasonic pulse from the water level meter, which I hang inside the well underneath the well cap. It sends that pulse down to the water table, reflects off the water table, comes back to the sensor, and it's used to calculate the distance to the water table. It immediately connects either to the internet through Wi-Fi or through a cellular connection. Most of my monitoring networks or devices are now using cellular connections because they're more reliable, and transmits that data, and it's plotted in real time on the internet. And we have a network that online with a dashboard that the public and water managers can access daily to see what our aquifer water levels and in some cases chemistry are doing in real time. And that's especially valuable during droughts, when people really want to know how low our aquifer levels, and if we got rain, for example, this week, how did that affect aquifer levels? Did they raise significantly, and has that made more water wells viable because groundwater levels are increasing? So that's something I expect to see more use of in the future because of the availability of the internet and cellular connections and these low-cost IoT and sensor devices.
Yeah, well, and if we make it like accessible to anyone, so the price will go down, quickly, right?
Yeah. So right now, the Wi-Fi versions of the water level Internet of Things devices that I'm building, I custom build them myself for about $200. That's the cost of the parts. If you want to make a cellular version, they're a bit more expensive, but only about $300. And that cost is still pretty low compared to off-the-shelf groundwater monitoring equipment, which is usually more like between $1,000 and $2,000 US to purchase. So I see this in other fields too, in hydrology, that the researchers are starting to make use of Internet of Things devices because the costs are so cheap, and the scientists are starting to build their own research equipment and use it for monitoring and research because it's not that hard to do anymore, and it's very cheap. So that's one thing I expect to see more of in the future.
I agree. Well, our idea is that in the future, that's trying to think ahead. That could be embedded into the pumps or to the well equipment, because it's it's going to be cheap compared to the pump itself, depend on the size of the pump, right? That could be an interesting thing for us to have,
Yeah,
for all communities, because we could be, well, like you said, we can have real-time information about the weather, and groundwater today we have none, pretty much, right?
Yeah, we definitely need to do a better job of monitoring, but I like your idea. That's an interesting idea to have pumps automatically fitted with them, because you already have a wire coming up to the surface.
Exactly, exactly.
And it would be probably a low cost compared to the the pump itself.
Yep.
So, that's an excellent idea. Maybe we'll see it develop soon. I haven't seen an example of that yet.
No, we haven't, because the guys from the pumping industry, they're not really into it because they're afraid of bringing too much government towards their work. That's the psychological barrier that we have to pass. Before we.
Yeah. I also see that in my line of work too. But I try to convince the well drillers and pump installers that it's within everybody's interest to make sure that our aquifers are managed wisely, because if they're not, people will no longer trust them, and they won't be used as water supplies, and then we're all out of employment. So I think it's wise that we all have common objectives to make sure that our groundwater resources are managed.
I'm in tune with your initiative. Very, very close with it. Definitely, I like to keep in touch with you to see how it evolves with you. Well, one of the things that I was talking to John is that we're actually draining our continents, because we keep constantly pumping water, and the water groundwater. It goes to the rivers, right, and to the oceans. So Wormwood published a paper showing that 20 to 25% of the ocean level rise is groundwater that was sent to the ocean. So we'll have to manage, monitor our groundwater much better than we're doing now. So that is the way to go.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I also hear that the majority of aquifers that are located in arid and semi-arid countries are suffering from aquifer depletion. So
exactly, yep.
We're not managing groundwater in a sustainable way, and we need to do that if we want to have water supplies in the future.
Yes, and if we don't measure it, how can we do it?
Exactly, which comes back to your idea about monitoring. You can't measure what you or manage what you don't measure.
You don't measure, exactly. Okay, thank you very much. That's it's an important topic, and we can talk for a long time here. But our interview is just this short. Thank you very much for showing up today, John. Thank you very much for your book. Please make your final statement for your potential readers.
Well, thank you very much, Everton, for the opportunity to speak with you today. And for final statements, I'll keep it brief, but maybe I'll break that into two parts. So for groundwater professionals and hydrogeology students, I think it would be important for them to remember that domestic wells are incredibly important, because they provide water to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And based on our discussions today, we can see that there's a great need to improve support to domestic well owners to help them ensure that their water wells are safe and reliable. So this is a really important and potentially very rewarding field to work in. So I would encourage anyone who has an interest to get involved in the field of domestic wells. And then finally, for any domestic well owners who might be listening, if there was one key message I would give to you, that would be, I would encourage you to have your water well quality tested to make sure that it's safe for you and your family to drink.
Yes, that's very important. Thank you very much. We had here John Drage. I encourage you to download his book. It's a great book. It's, as he mentioned, it's an introduction, but it's a very important one. And you see a lot about the domestic wells is an important thing. People tend to, overlook the importance of that, but it is very important. Thank you, John, for a nice work.
You're welcome, Everton. Thank you very much.